And this meeting is being recorded. Great. Okay. Emily, could you do me a favor? There's no way that I'll be able to see what the heck is going on in chat. So could you just unmute and interrupt me if anybody's got a good question?
Yeah, you got it.
Thank you so much. So you just met Emily. Emily Fyfe is my colleague at Indiana University, and my name is Ben Motz. And we are two of a larger group of what you might call like research leads on the ManyClasses project, which includes Josh and Paolo and Rob and Janelle. We came to you, Emily and I came to you, you being Unizin, in Denver, Colorado in 2019 with an invitation to join an outrageous, unprecedented, wild adventure of an experiment that isn't just run in a college classroom, which on its own is a really ambitious thing to do, but to join an effort where we would try to run this experiment in dozens of classrooms distributed across multiple institutions. Since 2019, we've managed to do it. And it has not just been a Ben and Emily, or even just a Ben and Emily and Josh and Paolo and Rob and Janelle sort of thing. It's been a massively collaborative effort. And I want to take a moment at this point to say that even though Ben and Emily are the presenters for this particular thing, it would not at all be possible without the involvement of not just Unizin, but the broader Unizin community. So this effort brought together a large number of dozens of instructors. And also we have co-authors who aren't instructors, but who were pivotal and instrumental for being able to have the project kind of take hold and also get realized. This includes Etienne and Kyle from Unizin. And in addition to the people who are authors on this paper that's coming out soon, we also want to acknowledge the involvement of people who might be considered to be, I don't know, in the periphery of the effort. So this includes people who have been at Unizin and who've been at all these institutions listed here. It really could not have been done without a massive collaborative undertaking, and I can't overstate the importance of acknowledging these people's contributions. This is not just a research accomplishment. This is an accomplishment in collaboration. And one of the things that I think is particularly beautiful about Unizin is the spirit, the core of everybody coming together and saying, okay, we can try something wild, yeah, for the virtues of research and showing a proof of concept of what Unizin could be capable of. So this is but one project. We're calling it ManyClasses 1, and we fully intend for there to be ManyClasses 2 and 3 and 4. And moreover, if this project that we've put together inspires similar efforts that we are not the leads of, we would be excited to pay it back and to contribute back whatever involvement and perspective we can offer. So yeah, this is my very long self-introduction of just saying, couldn't have done it without you. Thank you, Unizin. And with that, maybe I should tell you a little bit about what we actually did. Okay, so I'm going to start by saying that I think that we can all agree across Unizin that one of our core goals with the Unizin Consortium is to understand and optimize learning, that perhaps this is something that data could even contribute toward. And to understand and optimize learning, I think that that involves answering questions, such as those that I've listed here. For example, what types of classroom practices result in better memory? What interventions increase engagement? What materials improve performance? And across all the many different questions that I could list here, they all would take a common form, which is what thing does an instructor do? What thing does an instructor do cause Y some sort of outcome, so usually positive outcomes. To get evidence of a causal influence of this type of causal effect of X causing Y, I believe very strongly that it's important to do an experiment. I don't believe that's the only way of getting evidence of a causal effect, but I do think it's a particularly compelling and strong way of providing this evidence. So this is something that I care a lot about, and other psychologists care a lot about it too. I'm not totally alone in this regard. But unfortunately, experiments are hard. They're especially difficult to be able to construct. And that, I think, is a large part of the reason that why psychology studies are commonly conducted in controlled settings. So when psychologists do research on human learning, it's oftentimes in a lab where the materials are very contrived and the environment is very controlled. Even the lighting and the temperature is standardized. And that's interesting. It's interesting because it provides the setting for us to be able to explore causal relationships where we've eliminated any other possible factors that could influence the outcome. But it's also suboptimal if we actually wanted to understand and optimize learning in situ, in actual learning environments, such as in education settings. So what we really ought to do is we ought to take what we've learned about psychology of learning, and we ought to apply it to educational settings. That is to translate, to like bridge the research practice gap and try things out with field research where we try an experiment in an actual classroom environment. But in those situations, things get complicated. And to give you an example of why things get complicated and how things get complicated, I'm going to give you an example that's not from the study that we've run, but instead kind of gives you a rough flavor of what some of the challenges are. Let's talk about retrieval practice. Pretty much since the dawn of psychology, and even before the dawn of psychology, it's been known that practicing remembering something actually improves your memory trace for that thing. So in that regard, practicing retrieving a piece of information is a pretty constructive practice for those who want to learn something. This is something that even like Francis Bacon observed. So here's a quote from Francis Bacon. If you read a piece of text through 20 times, you will not learn it by heart so easily as if you read it 10 times while attempting to recite from time to time and consulting the text when your memory fails. And the basic idea is that, again, trying to retrieve something from memory, that volitional effort to get something out of memory should be something that actually solidifies or helps the memory trace become stronger. There's another quote from William James. In learning by heart, for example, when we almost know the piece, it pays better to wait and recollect by an effort from within than to look at the book again. This is something that's been demonstrated to be the case in many different laboratory studies, and it's also been ventured out into the field. So what you see here is a list of authors who wrote a particularly well-cited and impactful study about what you might imagine to be like psychological science practices that improve educational outcomes. And one of their core observations was that practice testing seems to benefit student performance across a wide range of criterion tasks and retentional intervals in actual educational settings. So you might say then, okay, if I want my students to learn something better, then what I ought to do is I ought to tell them that they should practice retrieving it. So some people did that. In fact, some people who are now in the Unizin consortium did that. So our colleagues over at Oregon State, Regan Gurung and Kathleen Burns, took this to task, and they took introductory psychology classes and had there were 8 of them total. They took 4 of the classes, and in those 4 classes, they encouraged students to practice retrieval on homework quizzes. And in the other 4, they just didn't do that, no encouragement. And they sure enough found that those students who were in the 4 classes where they encouraged them to practice retrieval did practice retrieval. That is to say that they actually took the quizzes more often than those classes where they didn't have that same encouraging effort. Paradoxically, they found that students who took the quizzes multiple times actually had lower exam grades and course grades than students who took quizzes only once. So this is wild. This is an observation where the thing that actually happened in the laboratory and the thing that had been observed in some small field experiments turned out to not generalize to this particular implementation of the study. And it's a fascinating research article. It'd be fun to read. It actually is an interesting introspection into what it's like being a researcher and observing something totally unexpected and how you make sense of that. So this is to the extent that this research article should stand as being something that we could trust, it provides evidence of a challenge to generalization of the benefits of retrieval practice. And that's not just a small thing, because generalization is really the paramount goal of theoretical research. What we want to identify is not just what works here and what works here and what works here in those 3 different places. We want to be able to generalize our inferences to say, if you do this, then it should be something that we would expect to improve outcomes across a wide variety of settings. That thing, generalizability, unfortunately, is almost never tested in education science, which would be something that you would need a replication study to try. And in those few instances where it has been tested, what we find is that education research outcomes are not robust. We only see evidence that's consistent with the original finding in about half of published replications. And Mark Schneider from the Institute for Education Sciences has said that 1/3 of IES-funded replications actually succeed in finding evidence consistent with the original observation. Mark Schneider's been pissed about this. He's the director of IES, and in 2018, he wrote a blog post where he basically articulated this view that I've gotten a heading here. The research on student learning is just fundamentally broken. I'm going to read this quote. He said, a central goal of the mission of the IES, again, the IES is the Institute of Education Sciences. It's like the research arm of the US Department of Education. He said, a central goal of the mission of IES is to identify what works for whom under what conditions. Unfortunately, most of the studies that have found impact contribute little to helping us meet that goal. Many, if not the great majority of these projects were carried out in a single location and/or tested using a relatively small number of settings, teachers, and learners. Given the limited scope of these projects, it's usually impossible to judge whether the tested interventions would work with different types of students or in different education venues. What Mark Schneider is saying is that there's a problem with research when it's conducted in small numbers of settings. And experimental research on classroom learning is practically always conducted on just one class. In such a situation, it's unclear what to do if you observe negative findings. That is to say, if you observe findings that are different from what you'd expect. It's possible that maybe the predictions are wrong, maybe theory is wrong, and what you observed is true. It's also possible that maybe there was just something weird about the sample that you happened to collect, and we wouldn't know because you only had one sample. It's also unclear whether the results that you observed would generalize to new classes, and it's unclear why the results were observed. So it might have been the case that the results that you observed are a dynamic interaction between the intervention and the context. And if we don't know about more than one context, it's hard to be able to pin down that interaction. If this is the problem, and I think that there's general agreement that this is a problem in education research, it's pretty clear what the solution is, and that's to do research on not just one class, but on many classes. And that's the basic idea behind ManyClasses. It like seems so obvious in retrospect, but I got to tell you, in 2017, we thought we were crazy by even proposing this as being a thing that we could do. The idea behind ManyClasses is that we would investigate educational practices, not just in one class, but across dozens of class contexts in the way that does two things. One, that maintains the rigor of a randomized experiment. And second, in a way that uses materials that are authentic to class norms. That is to say that we don't want to just run an experiment on, I don't know, English Swahili word pairs. We want to actually run an experiment that manipulates the things that a teacher would do if they were to adopt an instructional recommendation, like that you should practice retrieving for improved memory. So the model of ManyClasses is that within each individual class, we have the instructor do something. They take what they would normally do, and then they manipulate it so that it has two different versions that are relevant to the contrast that we're interested in exploring. And this is not with materials that we've provided. This is with the instructor's own learning materials. So there's a manipulation there, and then there's downstream an assessment of how much students have learned given that manipulation. And then students could switch condition assignments and then experience it in a different context, the other version, and then get an assessment as well. So this is within subject design, where sometimes students get one version of a treatment, other times students get another version of a treatment. I'll tell you a little bit more about the design of the study in a couple slides. I want to take a pause here and just describe the sample that we were able to collect for this first ManyClasses study, because I think that this is, I don't know, what a lot of you guys might be interested to learn more about. After our heartfelt invitation in 2019, we wound up with a sample that was 5 institutions from Unizin, IU, Penn State, Nebraska, Michigan, and Minnesota. From these institutions, there were 15 separate campuses, and the process was something like this, where once an institution agreed that this was something that they would want to do, there was some signatures that had to happen, supported by Indiana University's Office of Research Administration. And that was a signature that allowed basically a researcher to be added to course sites in that institution. So that would have exposed FERPA restricted data. So what we needed from these original agreements was an approval for a FERPA exception. So 5 institutions gave us this approval for a FERPA exception so that one researcher could be added to a course site. Once that approval was inked and everything, then we posted an open call for applications to that institution's instructors, usually by sending some sort of an email from the Center for Teaching and Learning or whatever its analog might have been at the different campuses. Usually there was I don't know, people who were generally interested in education research, who were excited about the opportunity to try this new thing. I've got to say the instructors who wound up applying through the call for applications are remarkable and diverse people. So we were delighted by the response. Once we got people who had applied, and everybody who applied, we signed them up. There was no like, okay, you met the threshold or something. We were happy to include every class that signed up. So that wound up being 38 classes with a total student enrollment of almost 3,000 students. There was a mean class size of 76 students per class. Once the researcher was added to these class sites, then one of the things that the researcher did was to create an informed consent assignment in Canvas. So there was an assignment for students to fill out an informed consent form and to mark what their response was in an assignment. So students, nothing was happening without student consent. There was great amounts of transparency in this particular experiment. So about 80% of the students who were enrolled in these courses wound up consenting. That comes up to a sample size of about 2,300 students. And from these courses, we then implemented an experiment. After that experiment happened, or after the experimental treatments, then the instructor would have normal assessments of what students had learned, and they would report to us what students' scores were on those assessments. These are like the outcomes of the experiment. And then downstream, not too long ago, actually, Unizin exported the data only for students who provided consent in a way that was de-identified from the source. So we were able to get behavioral data on the students who had provided us permission to be able to export that behavioral data. It was a good mix. We had a bunch of courses from a lot of different fields, so computer programming and humanities and natural science and physical science and math and social science. Yeah, I mean, that actually doesn't give credit to the diversity of these courses. We had very high level courses that were nuanced aspects of ecology, and we had speech courses, so like public speaking and language courses. It was really quite spectacular, the range of experiences that students were engaging in during this experiment. Okay, at this point, I should probably tell you what the experiment was. The experiment was about the timing of feedback. So ManyClasses 1 is an investigation about how the timing of feedback affects students' learning. You might think that this is something that like psychology has already figured out. But yeah, by this time, after 100 years of psychology research on learning, that we might know whether feedback should be administered as immediately as possible or delayed by a few days. But it turns out we don't know. There is current educational doctrine that pretty much comes from like B.F. Skinner that says that feedback should be administered as quickly as possible. But there is more recent research that suggests that delaying feedback might be beneficial for some really interesting reasons, like that it causes students to space their practice. It causes students to return to the material from a new perspective. And it's not just an atheoretic reason that delayed feedback might be better. There's reasons to believe that it might actually work. And it was a really convenient contrast for the first ManyClasses project. For one, because feedback is germane to every class. There's no class that we've encountered thus far where feedback is not an element of the educational practice within that class. And there's another big advantage for this being the first contrast that we run with ManyClasses, and that's that this experiment could be implemented natively in Canvas. There's a checkbox that happens to be checked here, where students are allowed to see their quiz responses after they take the quiz, but an instructor could uncheck it. And it turns out to be something that some instructors uncheck a lot, so that students, when they submit their work, wouldn't immediately see the right answers, because maybe then they would share it with other students. So just to give you a flavor of what this looks like from the student's perspective, a student could take a quiz and then submit it. But depending on their condition assignment, they could either see the screen on the left, which says, I'm sorry, you can't see your feedback right now, your quiz has been muted, or they would see the screen that you see on the right, which has the data about their quiz responses for that attempt, their score on that attempt, and whatever other things an instructor might have made available. So this is the core contrast, and let me show you how we designed an experiment around it. As I told you, we had 38 different classes. Each class was assigned to one incentive condition. This is something that we actually had manipulated at the class level. Some classes were asked to actually incentivize students to look at their feedback. So sometimes we actually said to the teachers, okay, can you make it so that there's maybe some extra credit or whatever works for you that students would get if they looked at their feedback? And this could be implemented in whatever way that an instructor might want. A normal way to implement it would have been to have a follow-up assignment where students had to mark some aspect of their feedback to be able to earn small amounts of credit for having looked at the feedback. So for example, this would be like, tell me what question you got wrong that was the hardest, or something like that. So that was only for half the classes. Other classes were not asked to have any incentive condition. Within each individual class, remember there was consent, so we had an informed consent process. And it's worth adding that consent process was encrypted from the instructor. So an instructor wouldn't know which students were participants or were not participants. It was something that only the ManyClasses researchers could see. And any individual student was assigned to get feedback that was delayed or feedback that was immediate on, for example, their first homework assignment, which would then be followed by an assessment of what they'd learned from that homework assignment. And as I mentioned before, this is within subject design. So then condition assignments would switch, and maybe then there would be a second homework assignment that would get delayed feedback if they had previously gotten immediate feedback, or vice versa, followed by a test again. So the general analytical approach is going to be to pool all these data together and to look to see for individual students whether there's a difference in their performance, depending on whether they got immediate feedback or delayed feedback on their authentic assessments within that class, basically unchanged due to the experiment. So this is trying to be as honest and as authentic to educational practice as we could possibly make it. So I'm going to show you the results in an interesting way, and I want to give you an orientation lesson in how to see these results. What we're going to do is we're going to have each individual class be like a row in a very tall stacked chart. And imagine that a class looks something like this. So I've added a line in red. And if the line happens to be on the right side of 0, on the right side of the dotted line, it means that students performed better on those assessments where they got immediate feedback relative to their peers. So all this stuff was z-scored and normalized at the course level. The extent of that line is what we'd call the 95% highest density interval. That's like the 95% confidence interval, but Bayesian style. We're fancy methodologists, so we went all Bayesian. The bold part of the line is the interquartile region, so the center 50% highest density interval, and the dot is the median. So we could observe classes where students tended to perform better following immediate feedback. That could be something that overlaps 0, and that would suggest that there might not be a reliable difference between delayed feedback and immediate feedback in that class. Those lines happen to be red. We could also have a blue line, which would mean that that class was assigned to the incentive condition. The red lines are going to be classes that didn't have any incentives for students to look at feedback. And yeah, obviously could go on the other side as well. The width of these bars gives us some indication of the uncertainty of these estimates. Okay. So knowing that is important because I'm about to show you a full stack of all of the different results for every individual class kind of stacked up. And remember, right side of the graph means immediate feedback is better. Left side means delayed feedback is better. Holy crap, Emily, this is the first time we're actually sharing these results publicly. This is wild. So yeah, I'm excited to be able to share with Unizin because again, we couldn't do it without you. So here it is, drum roll please. Well, let's fit in. Those lines all overlap 0. So there is no effect of delaying feedback or of having feedback posted immediately that generalizes across classes. I want to add something interesting about our particular analytical approach, and that was that we used a very hierarchical model. So in some ways, the uncertainty of estimates are drawn toward the tendency of all the classes. And that's not something that we enforced. It was something that happened kind of in a bottom-up way during our estimation process. So in a sense, the uncertainty in estimates is something that's shared between different classes. But overall, there's generally strong evidence of there being an overlap with 0. In fact, at the very bottom in that black line, it's the overall effect. You can see that that is pretty much lined up as close as possible to 0. And I've got another rendering of it here where really, this is kind of like a rendering of the full posterior distribution for both incentivized and non-incentivized classes. And you can see that it's pretty sharp on 0. Okay, so there is no broadly generalizable difference in learning performance when students receive immediate feedback compared with delayed feedback. It's not the case that there's uncertainty in these estimates. This is a remarkably strong effect of 0. So we are confident that there is no difference between immediate feedback and delayed feedback in the context of what I've just described. So the obvious next question would be, okay, well, there's differences between classes. Like we can see some classes, the interquartile range is on the right, and some classes, the interquartile range is on the left. So is there any property of classes that systematically describes why a class might tend to have an effect in the direction of delayed feedback being better, or tend to have an effect in the direction of immediate feedback being better? And let me show you that now. This is a hard graph to parse, but let me say that we collected, through the help of Unizin, properties of 40 different candidate moderating variables, ranging from the size of the class at the top all the way down to the number of quizzes that had feedback viewed, the amount of time spent on treatment quizzes. And what we found across this full analysis is that there was no strong evidence of systematic differences in the effects of feedback timing between students or classes. That is to say that none of these moderating variables were significantly different from 0 effect. But there were some that we looked deeper into. So I'll mark them with the blue lines here. The number of treatment, yeah.
Can you pause for just a second?
I would be delighted to pause. I've been talking for a long time.
Yeah, because I think getting into these will be really important, but I think answering these 2 questions in the chat will help contextualize the results before you move forward.
Okay.
Do you see them?
Okay, so Jose Silva Lugo asked, don't you think that you need a statistical analysis to make sure that we have significantly difference? Okay. So this is an interesting tangent, and I'd be excited to walk out on it a little bit. We didn't do a statistical analysis with the goal of null hypothesis significance testing. That is to say that we didn't do a test where we were looking for a p-value that would tell us under a null model how improbable are the results that we've observed. Instead, we did an analysis that might be described as Bayesian estimation. So we were trying to directly estimate the tendency of differences between students when they got delayed feedback compared with when they got immediate feedback within their courses. So this is a really, really, really detailed statistical analysis that we did run, but it's different from those that would normally seek whether the result is significant or not. I would love to talk in more depth about the statistical analysis that we approached this with, and it's all open. So we've made the analysis scripts and everything publicly available on an OSF project site, and we'd be excited to share and tell you all about it. This is a gospel that I'm excited to preach. So let me know if you have more detailed questions, or you could also email me offline if you want me to point you in the direction. This is something that we'd be happy to talk about. Morgan asked, did you make this graph with R? This looks like a ggplot. The honest answer is I don't know. We spent a lot of time on this graph, and I don't know where we netted out with it. It might have been with ggplot. Yeah, I'll have to interrogate my script to find out where we netted out. It turned out to be hard. A lot of our analyses are in R. Yeah, and again, they're all posted openly. We'd be excited for it to be something that we share. Good questions. Should I keep going? What do you think, Emily? Okay.
Go for it.
So again, the ones that I've kind of highlighted in blue are things that we decided we would look deeper into for two reasons. One is that if you look at these particular moderating variables, they're ones where there seems like there might be a difference. That is to say, either these are shifted in one direction, or there's a split between those courses that were assigned to the incentive condition and those courses that were assigned to the not incentivized condition. So that's the first reason, is that there was a data-driven reason for looking deeper at these. The second reason is that these are roughly related to the dosage of the experimental manipulation. So the number of treatment quizzes actually is a measure of how much feedback a student would have gotten. The delay length is a description of the dosage of delayed feedback. And also there's theoretical reasons for also being interested to look at the percent of retrieval-based items. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the courses had multiple choice questions for their outcome assessment. Some of the courses had retrieval-based items. These are like you had to fill in the blank. And yeah, that difference was something that there's reason to believe might moderate the difference between immediate feedback and delayed feedback. So we look deeper into these, and my next slide has those plots. Again, these plots are a little bit funny looking. Let me try to walk you through it. Every individual dot is a course. So there are 38 dots in each of these three different plots. And like before, if it's a blue dot, then it's a course that was assigned to the no incentive condition. And if it's a red dot, then it was a course that was assigned to the incentive condition. On the y-axis is the relative benefit of immediate feedback. So higher numbers means that there was a benefit of immediate feedback in that class, and lower numbers, negative numbers, means there was a benefit of delayed feedback in that class. And you can see that the x-axis is each of these moderating variables that I referred to previously, the number of treatment quizzes, days between the due date and delayed feedback, and also the proportion of retrieval-based exam items. So in spite of the fact that they were not significant, or they didn't hit our objective threshold when we pre-registered the experiment of being something that we would consider to be credible, and they didn't meet our decision threshold for being a strong effect. Nevertheless, there are directional trends here that suggest that increasing the dosage of feedback and the length of delay might result in benefits for delayed feedback, especially when viewing feedback is incentivized and when tests are retrieval-based. The reason that this is not something that we feel like we can make strong statements about is partially because we didn't have really good coverage of regions in this design space that you're looking at right here. So I'm hoping you can you see my cursor if I wave it around? So on the left graph, you can see that there were only 3 classes that had more than 12 treatment quizzes. And most of the courses had relatively small numbers of treatment quizzes. So to the extent that there might be benefits for delayed feedback on this side of the graph, it's an undersampled region. Same over here with days between due date and delayed feedback. Just by virtue of random assignment kind of kicking us, it turned out to be the case that we didn't have any courses where looking at feedback was incentivized that also had delays that were greater than 3 days. So it's only blue lines over here. So it would have been nice if we had a course that just happened to be assigned to incentive condition over here in the 5 days of delay. But yeah, again, an undersampled region. And it's hard to see in this graph over here, but I put a note at the top that 75% of our courses had 1/4 of the exam items be not retrieval based. So we had only 1/4 of the sample be courses where there was a reasonable number of retrieval based exam items. So it's another reason that we feel comfortable seeing suggestive evidence here, but really there was sparse coverage in these regions that prevented us from being able to make strong conclusions. Okay. So speaking of conclusions, I should talk about conclusions. One big conclusion is that despite theoretical debates that have extended for decades, we've got a pretty strong stake in the ground that says that no single invariant benefit exists for immediate or delayed feedback when administered in Canvas on, for example, auto-graded Canvas quizzes. This is a big deal. I think that there's a lot of theoretical things that we could discuss about this particular conclusion, and also practical things that we could discuss about this particular conclusion. You know, we're experiencing a pandemic, and we've been through remote instruction for a long time, and there's a great deal of stress placed not just on university instructors, but teachers as a population. And to be able to say, okay, if you need an extra day to give feedback on the work that students just gave, there's no benefit that's reliable and that generalizes across classes for students to get their feedback on that day when they submit. I think that that'll actually do a lot to improve the experience of being a teacher, to not have that particular kind of, or to have that stress relieved. So that's one important conclusion, that there is not a single benefit. Another important conclusion is that pinning down the settings where benefits might be observed of one or the other will require even larger samples. So while ManyClasses 1 was unprecedented in its scale and also in the diversity of its sample, it is perhaps going to need to be an order of magnitude larger for ManyClasses 2 to be able to actually identify portions of the design space, and maybe even very intentional samples across that design space, for us to be able to make these moderating effects appear much more strong and significant. That said, there is some hints of improvements for delayed feedback in undersampled contexts, and it's something that I think that would merit more research. And that, yeah, this is a really good springboard for that type of research. Might not need to be as aggressive in terms of its sample as we've done thus far. Okay, and third, large-scale distributed experimentation in online learning settings, it's feasible. We did it, and it's especially feasible given the affordances that Unizin has provided. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into the feasibility of this study, because we're here with the Unizin community, and I think that this is a portion that I think a lot of people would be interested in, learning a little bit more about our experiences from ManyClasses. So I've listed here 3 multi-institutional research lessons learned. So for those among us who are interested in either supporting or actually carrying out multi-institutional research via Unizin, these are things that I would offer as being important takeaways. First takeaway is actually something that Emily contributed to the team when she joined, and that's that we shouldn't just talk about multi-institutional research, we should just do it. So let's come up with a study and not bicker about how we'll do it. Let's come up with a study and pilot it so that we can actually find out what steps there might be that we would need to take. And that was a really instructive approach. And it made it so that we weren't just spending years talking about the study, but we were actually working through challenges in practicality. But I noticed that David's here. When we first started the study, David told us, you should plan on it taking twice as long as you think it'll take. And I remember thinking, no, it's going to be easy. The data is collected passively. Teachers are a fun bunch. But David was so right. It took twice as long as we thought it would take. And it actually took 3 times as long as we thought it would take, but that was because of the pandemic. So yeah, it will take a long time, but doing it, actually taking the steps instead of thinking about the steps, is important. I also want to advocate for designing research with variation in mind. And when you're doing so, seeking involvement from teachers. We started today with a keynote talk that was actually kind of hypercritical of a causal relationship in general. between a teaching intervention and an outcome in student behavior or in student outcomes. And I want to kind of endorse that criticality. So these causal relationships between intervention and outcome are probably not stable across different contexts. And understanding the variability between contexts is something that I think that we could do a better job of, both as education researchers and as teachers. So I think that seeking involvement from teachers was key to ManyClasses' success. And it's something that I would like to see we iterate on as there's more multi-institutional research throughout the Unizin consortium. Lastly, this was hard. I've thought about including in the PowerPoint presentation some pictures that Emily and I had taken of ourselves while we were like in the trenches trying to work through data analysis and stuff. And we had long faces. It was hard work. And I didn't include them here because we're happy now. Everything worked out. But it is clearly the case that experimental research in education needs better tools. This is not only something that we as a ManyClasses team are aware of. It's something that very much in many ways is at the core of IES's current funding strategy. And it's something that we experienced even when we were putting the project together. So for this study, even though we didn't have like dedicated developers or a platform for running the experiment, we still built tools. For example, we built a tool for collecting consent from students in a Canvas assignment in a way that was encrypted from the teacher. That hadn't existed. And it couldn't have been possible to run this study if we hadn't also created a cloud function that managed students' assignments to experimental conditions at scale in Canvas course sites. So it was wild. Like students would drop the course or add the course, and we would need to update condition assignments to make sure that students wouldn't get stuck in courses that they had dropped, and also so that new students could actually get exposure to their educational research. To their educational materials. So this was hard, and for future studies, we see promise in a nascent opportunity to build a tool that would support experimental research at scale in any course site in Canvas, and that's something that we call terracotta. So terracotta is actually a portmanteau. It's a portmanteau for tool for educational research with randomized control trials. And we've just received seed funding from Schmidt Futures to build the alpha prototype for terracotta. The actual build is going to be built by Unicon. We've just gotten approval for a contract with Unicon actually last night. And the basic idea is that terracotta is an add-in to a Canvas course site that would allow an instructor, potentially in collaboration with a researcher, to set up an experiment so that it runs magically in a way that doesn't involve the amazing amounts of laborious effort that Emily and Janelle and I invested on a course-by-course basis. I'll also add that this is coming down the pike relatively rapidly. The X Prize, in collaboration with the Institute for Education Sciences, has now opened a digital learning challenge. This digital learning challenge has a total purse of about $1 million. And the competition asks the winning team to minimally demonstrate its ability to conduct an RCT or a quasi-experimental design using any meaningful and substantive education intervention, to systematically replicate the experiment at least 5 times in no more than 30 days. But we got that covered. We did 3 dozen. And also to replicate the experiment with at least 3 different distinct demographics. And this is something that I think that Unizin would be an interesting place to try and explore these possibilities. So I'm not doing an open call for participation just yet. They haven't posted yet the terms of the prize, and whether this looks like it's something that could be ManyClasses style or not is an open question. Once they post, they're actually going to post the proposal documents tomorrow. There might be opportunities that we could collaboratively explore. But let's zoom out. There is a big science picture of what we can accomplish with these types of tools and methods. One of the things I want to state very clearly is our observation, both through my own personal research over the past decade and Emily's, that small sample research on what works is often not suited to answer the question. It might explain what works in a unique context, but not necessarily what works in a generalizable fashion. If we were interested in what works at scale, it would be useful to do experiments, because correlation is not causation. We need more than just data to be able to make connections between what's going on and what the outcomes are associated with what's going on. So we've proposed a way to facilitate experimental research that addresses this question of scale. And it's worth adding that ManyClasses but one model for this. So there's other models out there, and it's worth, if this is something that you're interested in, highlighting these other approaches. So the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, is kind of like a quasi-governmental foundation that's interested in doing these types of experiments at scale of trying to find out what works in education contexts across many different samples. Also, Character Lab is doing research that's very similar to this. This is sometimes more focused on social psychology interventions, but I think that they're making interesting forays into ways that you could imagine the intervention being something that's unique and tailored to the properties of the student or to the properties of the school. And then lastly, out of University of Michigan, I want to give some love to Seismic. So Seismic does have efforts to try and come up with large-scale experimental interventions that would be piloted in lots of different introductory science courses, and how we can close gender gaps in terms of student performance and success in science courses. So ManyClasses, nevertheless, I think is an exciting model for pursuing what you might imagine to be instructional intervention research. So I'm excited to have been able to share it with you today. So that's it. I would like to say many thanks, because we like many things. And yeah, if you'd like any more information, then feel free to email Emily or myself. You could hit us up on Twitter. And I think I'll stop now and we'll take questions. Let me learn how to stop here. Okay. Or we could all just look at each other. That'd be cool too. Thank you, Pamela. It's cool that you've articulated this interesting distinction between replicability and generalizability. This is an area that I don't know if you've seen. The Twitterverse is on fire about a paper that Talia Arconi just got accepted into behavioral brain sciences, where he advocates that the replication crisis might actually be reframed as a crisis of generalizability. And that, yeah, maybe a core aspect of our difficulty at replicating things is that there just aren't abstract principles that generalize in the way that somebody might assume them to. So yeah, coming out in the next few months will be our response to Tal's target article in BBS. And we posted that openly, our preprint openly on SciArchive. So if you'd like a link to any of that, then let me know. Emily, do you want to answer the next question? I feel like I've been talking way too much.
I can. I'm also directly in the sunlight here. Kevin Charles, thank you for your question. It says, what does ManyClasses plan to do next? So one goal Ben sort of already hinted at is that thinking about this learning technology that can support randomized experiments is one of our big needs, actually, to go forward with more ManyClasses projects, because we can't keep doing all of the manual coding ourselves. So that's actually one of our invested efforts that Ben is taking charge of and doing a great job at. In terms of actual studies, we have ideas for what to do next. Ben at the beginning of his presentation talked about this long-standing notion of retrieval practice, and we have a study design ready to go for thinking about how retrieval practice gets implemented in classes and how to compare assignments that actually support retrieval practice and assignments that don't. So we have a design ready. We're in the process of seeking funding and logistics and things like that, but that's sort of our next steps, I'd say.
And yes, absolutely, Jose. I'd be excited to share the PowerPoint presentation. Yeah, you could Google me or something, but I'll put my email in chat. It's got many different megabytes in it, so I hope it doesn't break your email, but yeah, I'm happy to post it. Whoa, David's actually raising his hand. It's a virtual hand. I don't know, yeah, it's a digital hand. I don't think he's just waving. How's it going, David?
Can you hear me?
I can.
This is also cool. I'm so glad that this is out. It was really cool to see it, and I just love that phrase. Just really strong evidence of no difference there. The summary figure. You with EEF, with the education, I forget what the other one is now, but foundation. They have a kind of a, it's something similar to an evidence clearinghouse that I know that the IES also has. Are these the types of things that you want to include in those type of standards? One thing that we've been pondering recently and working with a couple of others on is issues such as this, applying a proposed intervention in multiple settings, multiple classroom settings, as one of the kind of criteria for how EEF would say something works, or IES with their What Works Clearinghouse. Do you have any opinions on that? Not to put you on the spot, particularly for that, a little bit of a tangent, but it's something that's been on the side burner for a little while.
That's an excellent question. It's funny, one of the things that Emily and I talk about when we talk about ManyClasses is that there's many different audiences, and how this particular project makes some of the audiences feel satisfied or not is an interesting question that we've dealt with perennially. So yeah, when we set out to do ManyClasses, it was, I think, from the standpoint of we ought to be testing theory and improving methodology for testing theory. And I don't think that it's false to say that the practical effects on teachers was not the top priority for when we were doing this. But nowadays I'm thinking a lot about evidence libraries too. And yeah, how results of a ManyClasses like study would actually become disseminated for practice. I don't know. I don't feel like ManyClasses is the sort of thing that should be a standard for something getting into an evidence library or not, partly because it was such a wildly laborious effort. So I instead would like to believe that when somebody does a ManyClasses project, it closes the book on an evidence library, and it makes it so that a question has been so soundly answered that the instructional takeaway is kind of a given. But that said, yeah, I do think that there's reasons to look deeper into certain aspects of this, and that the results of a ManyClasses like study would allow evidence libraries to have more qualified findings, which I think is a necessary thing in general for evidence libraries. Emily, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, my thoughts are, in terms of the Institute of Education Sciences has the What Works Clearinghouse, and they vet certain projects. And I think they've thought really, really carefully about sort of experimental design and what counts as an experiment or as a quasi-experiment, and how are we going to categorize a particular project. But I think something that comes out of other projects, including ManyClasses, is that maybe we need to be thinking more carefully too about these other prongs about diversity in context. So how many different types of classes, for example, or student populations, or sort of the authenticity of materials. So, I think it at least sheds light on some of these issues that might be considered more carefully from these sort of clearinghouse places. But yeah, I'm not certainly wouldn't want this to be the standard for all research, or my other work would fall short.
For sure, yeah.
Yes, Janae, that was so that's the target article. And if you give me a second, if somebody else has another question, I guess I could post in some things into chat that answer some of these questions. So it would have been cool if I had this all prepared ahead of time.
I'll say verbally to Morgan that everything pretty much has been shared publicly, right, on our OSF website.
So there's a link to the files tool on OSF, on our OSF project site for ManyClasses 1. And yeah, you'll actually find all of our data. So we've posted data publicly well in advance of executing the pre-registered analysis scripts. So yeah, you could run your own analyses if you wanted to, including some supplemental analyses that we decided to just post rather than wait to have them included into the manuscript. So we've got a couple under the manuscript folder there, supplements that are related to exploratory moderators and also to a manipulation check that we ran. Let's see. I also wanted to paste into chat. Here's the paper that we have accepted and now is just a preprint of our response to Tal Yarkoni's target article in BBS. Yeah, which describes ManyClasses, but also explains the way that we're thinking about effects in education. That, yeah, there's perhaps it's the case that we need to rethink what it means for an effect to transfer between these different situations. So there's a research to practice gap that I referred to at the very beginning of my talk. But even once you make a successful translation across that gap, it's not necessarily the case that that thing that you observed in the first practice, in the first field experiment, will translate to what we call the practice to practice gap. So the importance of translating what you've observed in one practice to other practices really is important if we're assuming that what's moved from the research to practice gap is an abstract principle. We really need to assess it. Yeah. Well, session host, we're 2 minutes over. I guess that we could stick around if anybody has additional things that they want to chat about, but maybe at this point we should wave at everybody and say thank you so much for coming. It was really a pleasure to be able to share.
That was a great presentation, and if people have questions, I mean, this is the last session of the day. I know we have that social hour, but I won't cut you off if people continue to have questions. So.
Hi, Michelle. Hey, Renee.
Hey,
Great job,
Ben.
guys. That was so fun. I'm going to head to the social hour because I'm hosting it, but hope to see you all there.
Ben, I'm feeding a banana to a baby right now, so that's why my camera was off most of the time.
That's a good reason to be covert. Yeah, who knows what might happen.
Baby's flailing things. At some point, I'm going to ask you, you know, oh, there's my friend Matt. There's this thing called edX that we're involved in, and they actually do quite a bit of A/B research within their platform. But I don't, it's really up to you to tell me whether or not that makes sense to look at, or we're very in with Unizin and the particular platform is not an area of interest.
It's a good question. The guy who made edX, like the original developer, is a guy named Piotr. And Piotr is like deep in some of my circles. He posts like these lengthy, I don't know, reports. So yeah, it's clearly something that he's interested in supporting in edX. And yeah, if it's something that you'd like to see more of, then it's a conversation we could have. It'd be hard. I don't want to sound like I'm totally dismissive of MOOC research, but I kind of am.
Reasonable. The population is completely different.
And the motivations for learning is different. And it's not to say that there isn't learning happening in it. It just, some of the assumptions that we get for free by having it be a credit-bearing course are valuable. Yeah.
They are moving into the space now of having credit-bearing. And they are structured in a way that allows more A/B testing. So there are multiple institutions in there, including IU, doing credit-bearing. So there's some possibility. But yeah, it just made me think that. I was like, why haven't I talked to Ben about this?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to have a conversation. Yep, I'm already talking with Piotr all the time. So yep.
Cool. It was great hearing all the work. I hadn't gotten a chance to follow it, so thanks.
I appreciate it. What's up, Matt? How's it going?
Oh, good. Great presentation as always. So appreciated seeing where ManyClasses is going. A little disappointed that the terracotta name didn't have anything to do with gnomes, but just a little disappointed in that one. So.
That's okay. Yeah, I can't let that go too far out of the bag. Yeah.
You can make that the third thing you do, Ben. The third thing you can start with gnomes.
Okay. Yep. It's going to be somewhere. It's funny. I talked with, so Emily knows about it. Kevin and the rest of it, I'm definitely not going to share. It's totally PG-13 at minimum. But the basic idea is that there's a consumer product that I'm trying to make of a gnome that's in a not too flattering position. And so I need to like figure out sourcing of materials and logistics and everything. And there's a guy who's like, I don't know, he's deep into into entrepreneurship and stuff. And he decided that he wanted to partner with me on it. And he's now kind of like wrapped up in the difficulties of plastic sourcing nowadays. It's hard. So I don't know what's going to happen. We'll see. Well, Matt just totally left. Is he trying to get a gnome right now? I don't know what he's. What's up, Kevin? How's it going?
Yeah, I wanted to actually chat with you. I didn't really want to be recorded, but
Session host, can you stop recording? Yeah.
right.
Okay, yeah. I wasn't sure if this was still if you want me to keep the recording going. I can
Let's
go
let
and
us
shut
all
that
off
down.
the hook.
Unfortunately, if I leave the session, it will end for everybody. I think I can
Okay.
make you the host. Let me see if I can do that. Oh, let me
Yeah, that'd be
turn
great.
off that recording first. I'm gonna make. Yeah, looks like if I make you the host, I can probably leave without affecting everybody else. Let's see.
Okay. Well, it worked. Sorry. Okay, but we're still recording, so I have to stop recording now. Okay.